Get that topped out. Okay. You asked about lines of. Give it a couple minutes to let people log in, finish the process of making technology work. Everybody enjoying the cold weather?
No, I don't like. I like it 80.
Yes, I like it.
I like it 75, 77.
It could be worse. You could be living where there's snow.
It's cold. It's very cold today. Very cold.
I think we'll.
That's why we left New York, because we don't like the cold weather.
Well, we only get days like this a few times a year, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, a minute or so. All right, I think that's getting close to where we usually are for our group. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to do something a little bit different today. Normally, as you know, we will study one particular chapter, or more than likely one part of one chapter. And even then, we usually drill down deeply only on one or two of the verses or ideas in that section. However, that can sometimes make it hard for us to see the big picture themes that are found throughout the Torah. And this particular section of the Torah in Vayeishev, there are three separate stories, each in their own chapter, that each seem to be totally unrelated one to the other. And what we're going to do today is try and see how they actually connect, not only thematically, but linguistically, how the language itself is indicating that the Torah sees these as being a unified tale, even though they are set very differently. The first is the story of Joseph and his brothers, where he is sold into slavery and then claimed to be dead when they tell their father. The second is the story of Judah and Tamar, which we'll look at in more detail since it contains many of the elements found in the other two very clearly, and it's relatively brief. And then in chapter 39, we hear about Joseph's times in Egypt, in particular, his life in the house of Potiphar. All three of the topics, sibling rivalry, the Levirate marriage of Tamar, and the potential adultery in Potiphar's house, seem very separate, very unique. All of them seem to be jumping from one to the other. If this was in a modern movie or TV show, we'd probably complain that the editing was a little uneven, that it didn't seem like they were telling a unified story. Perhaps each would work as their own episode, but even then, there isn't enough tie between the three stories to make us understand why they are here. However, what I'd like to share today is a way of looking at all three stories and the specific word choice, languages, and structure that each uses to show that the Torah knew what it was doing, that it was tying them together in a way that may not be immediately obvious to modern readers, but is very much, nevertheless, a powerful tool for understanding and interpreting the text. So, with that as the introduction, let's get down to work. We are going to, by our standard, zip through chapter 38, and I'll be pointing out a few highlights as we go. But we're not going to dwell too long on any one section, because I want to look at the other two bookends of this chapter as well. You'll see what I mean as we go. So a reminder, chapter 38 sits right after the chapter where Joseph was almost murdered, but then sold into slavery. And one of the main ringleaders of that particular affair was Judah. Chapter 38, verse 1. About that time, Judah left his brothers and camped near the Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite woman named Shua, and he married her and cohabited with her. So here we see Judah, and we are reminded that he is an adult. People often portray the brothers of Joseph as somehow all being like 10 years old when they're fighting. They were mostly adult men. Benjamin perhaps was a bit younger, but all of them would have been either late teens or more than likely in their 20s. And we can see he is now getting married. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Er. Right? So we have the firstborn of Judah, and his name is Er. She conceived again and bore a son, and named him Onan. And now we have the second son named Onan. Here we see, just as an aside, that something we don't notice in the English, the first son was named by Judah, the second son was named by his wife, Shua. It's clear from the verb in the feminine form that Onan was given his name by his mother. There are some commentators who argue that this was a custom at the time, where the first child would be named by one parent and then the second child by the other. Verse 5, once again she bore a son and named him Shelah. He was at Chiziv when she bore him. So we have the birth of three sons, and that is the establishment of a good family. We see that as being a strong pattern. Judah got a wife for Er, his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. The assistance with children having wives is perfectly normal and natural, but we also understand here at this point that years have gone by. Otherwise, his son would not be old enough to be married. As we're going to see, he is definitely not having a perfect child marriage. That is to say, it's not that he is being engaged when he's 3 years old. Certainly, he is old enough that he will consummate the relationship. And we, of course, saw that Jacob, his father as well, Isaac, also had a wife provided for him. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to the Lord, and the Lord took his life. We do not know exactly what Er did, but we are going to see that there is a pattern, that his sons, at least the first two, are not the most upstanding of people. But more important to our story, this leaves Tamar in the state of Yibum. That is to say, she is in need of his brother to marry her in order to produce an heir that would be considered Er's heir. Sorry, couldn't resist. In verse 8, that is what's going to happen. Then Judah said to Onan, join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law, and provide offspring for your brother. So indeed, it gets put into motion where his heir's brother Onan is going to marry Tamar in order to be able to have an offspring that will be considered the child of Er. That, of course, means that Er's estate will continue in the line of this new son, and it would not, as might otherwise happen, rejoin the family estate and potentially be distributed to Onan himself. But Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. What he did was displeasing to the Lord, and he took his life also. So Onan is not willing to build up his brother's house. Again, there may have been a financial incentive for him not to, but it is definitely not the moral thing to do. It's certainly under the settings that he was in. And so he would deliberately ensure that although he was cohabitating with Tamar, that his seed would not create offspring. And I'll leave you to figure out exactly how that worked. That's a detail for another conversation. Verse 11. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, 2 of my sons are dead. That means the third is now up to bat. Stay in your widowhood in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. So he is saying, my son Shelah is not old enough yet to get married. So go back to your father's house, hang out there as a widow. But she is technically pre-married to Shelah. That is the way that Levirate marriage works. As soon as the brother dies, the next brother is automatically engaged. And remember, engagement is a very strong legal term in Jewish practice. And so she is bound to this young man who is not yet old enough to get married. However, there is an ulterior motive, not only Shelah's youth. For he, meaning Judah, thought, he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So it seems that Judah is worried that Tamar is some sort of black widow, that she has been married to 2 of his sons, and both of them have died, and therefore it must be something wrong with her. Now, we, the omniscient reader, know that it is not her fault, that it says explicitly that both and Onan did something that was wrong in the sight of God, and that is why they died when they died. Judah, of course, is not omniscient. He is only seeing that the 2 of them died while married to her, and he is drawing perhaps a superstitious conclusion here. All right, questions on the setting up to this point? I know we're going a bit quicker than we normally go through a story, but I want to see if people are following along okay. Okay. A long time afterwards, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. So now Judah is also a widower, just like Tamar is a widow. When his period of mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers together with his friend Hira the Aldulamite. Right, so he eventually gets through with the period of Shiva, or Shloshim in this case, the period of grief, and he goes on to return to the sheep shearers up in the hills where that would usually be done. And Tamar was told, your father is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing. So she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, and, wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as wife. So Tamar decides that something is amiss, right? She was supposed to marry Shelah, and she is still technically almost half married to him through the Levirate system. And yet, even though he is now old enough, Judah has not brought him or brought her back to be married and to continue the process. The process, of course, being giving the heir to the deceased. So she decides to take matters into her own hands. She covers herself so she is now incognito, and she heads out and waits along the road that she knows that Judah will be traveling. Verse 15, when Judah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face. He didn't recognize her. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here, let me sleep with you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. What, she asked, will you pay for sleeping with me? So he assumes that she is a prostitute, and he makes a proposal. She seems agreeable, and she's simply asking for payment. He replied, I will send a kid from my flock. But she said, you must leave a pledge until you have sent it. Right, so it's he doesn't have any cash on him, so to speak, and nothing else of value to barter. So he provides a promise, and she would like a pledge to know that that promise will actually be fulfilled. And he said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your seal and cord and the staff which you carry. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. So she finally has the child that she was supposed to, although through a different method than was normal at the time. And she also has his ID. The staff, the seal, the cord, those are essentially like 3 forms of ID. She would be able to produce them to prove that she had a claim against him and that he owed her something. It'd be the equivalent in the modern world of leaving behind your passport and driver's license and credit card or something like that. Then she went away, she took off her veil, and again put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he could not find her. So he does honor the pledge that he made to pay, but obviously she is no longer there, and there was no one to receive that payment. He inquired of the people of the town, where is the cult prostitute? Kedeshah is a euphemism that's often used for prostitute. The reason why it's termed cultic is because in many of the ancient worlds, the prostitutes would be part of the religious ceremonies, and that introduced the use of the word kodesh as the root for this profession. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that he would have thought her actually to be involved with an idolatrous practice when he was with her. This may just be the equivalent of saying the streetwalker, even though he didn't meet her on the street, using a generic term that sounds more specific than it might necessarily be. Where is the cult prostitute, the one at A9 by the road? But they said, there has been no prostitute here. Right? Well, obviously, Tamar was not a regular there, and nor was anyone else. So he returned to Judah and said, I could not find her. Moreover, the townspeople said, there has been no prostitute here. Judah said, let her keep them, lest we become a laughingstock. I did send her this kid, but you did not find her. Right, so Judah does not want to become mocked as the guy who's known for looking for the prostitute and who was owing the prostitute money and was like walking around sheepishly, trying to find her. That's just a embarrassing situation to be in for somebody that is the head of a clan. So he basically shrugs and says, look, I tried to do what I could. I tried to fulfill my oath. She's not there. If that's the way she wants it, then I'm not going to hunt her down any further. Everyone with us so far? Okay. 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child by harlotry. Bring her out, said Judah, and let her be burned. All right, so how did they know that she has been the harlot? Well, first of all, we have to understand that the word that is used for a harlot here is used for a woman that has been licentious outside of marriage. Everyone knows that she has not finalized her marriage to the third son, Shelah, and therefore, if she's pregnant, it had to be with someone other than him. And if she is pregnant by someone other than him, then she's been fooling around. It doesn't necessarily mean that they believe that she was accepting cash for sex. It does mean, however, that they realize that she quite clearly has broken her engagement bond to Shelah. And Judah says, well, the punishment, at least at that time in that community, for such an act of adultery would be to be burned. As she was brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. I am with child by the man to whom these belong. And she added, examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these? Right? Haker na. Right? So that is a phrase that is basically saying, do you recognize these things? Right? Are these familiar to you? And she holds them out to him through the messenger to see whether or not he will admit that he is the father of that child. As an aside, during the days before the Torah was given, Levirate marriage seems to have been a practice within the ancient communities. It seems that the brothers had the first obligation, but that other male relatives could also fulfill that role. That's why even though she went out of order, it doesn't seem like she is in as much trouble as she would have been had this taken place later on during the time when the Torah had been given. And Judah recognized them. Now, here, Vayaker can mean more than just recognize. It can also mean that he recognized and admitted that they were his. And he said, she is more right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he was not intimate with her again, meaning that he did not continue the relationship. The child had been conceived, and that was sufficient to fulfill the Levirate duty, and that was done. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread on that hand to signify this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand and out came his brother, she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." So he was named Perez. Afterwards, his brother came out, on whose hand the crimson thread, on whose hand was the crimson thread. He was named Zerach. Zerach in the Hebrew, Zerach, positive, never mind. It's just that wonderful crossover in the translation and transliteration. So that's the story of Judah and Tamar. A nice little episode that seems totally out of place in the story of Joseph. Joseph being thrown into a pit and sold, Joseph being taken to Potiphar's house, and in between, we have this. What's going on? Before we answer that, any questions or comments on the Judah and Tamar story before we look at the broader patterns? Okay. Let me just adjust my boxes. Hopefully everyone can see this. So I tried to put some parallel texts together so that people would be able to see how different selections from chapter 37, 38, and 39 parallel one another. Chapter 38, the one we just read, is sitting here in the middle, right? And as she was brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law, "I am with child by the man to whom these belong." And she added, "Examine these, hakerna," right? Tell me who these are. That was the section we just read. If we turn back to chapter 37, what do we find from verse 31? Then they, the brothers, took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please examine it." Hakerna, right? Same exact phrase that's being used. Is it your son's tunic or not? He recognized it the same way that Judah recognized the staff as his and said, "My son's tunic, a savage beast devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast." So we can see there is a strong similarity between the presenting of evidence of a crime or an issue and the recognition of that evidence. And of course, the one who was instigating this in chapter 37 was Judah. And the one who is now on the receiving end in chapter 38 is Judah. And we can see then, as Radak tries to point out for us, Bereshit Rabbah, but Radak is quoting it, note how the Torah plays with people. She hinted to Judah that he had used the same words, to deceive his father into believing that Joseph had been devoured by a wild animal. Now it was his turn to be deceived. The punishment matches the crime, or as we say in Hebrew, midah kineged midah, a measure against measure. The Torah, knowing what was to happen in the future, smiled to itself, thinking, wait until you will be deceived by these same words. But of course, if we look at an even broader view, we also know that Jacob too deceived with clothing. Jacob too deceived the identity. Where we see back in Genesis 27 on the left-hand column, Isaac said to Jacob, "Come closer that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob drew close to his father Isaac, who felt him and wondered. The voice is the voice of Jacob, yet the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like those of his brothers Esau, and so he blessed him. So we see that Jacob received the blessing because of a failure to recognize, and therefore his father Isaac drew the wrong conclusion. But we see in the chapter 37 that Jacob correctly recognizes the clothing of his son, however, draws again the wrong conclusion, believing now that his son has been killed by a wild beast rather than alive and taken away as a slave. And of course, done so by his other brothers. So we actually see 3 generations all involved in deceiving one after the other, beginning with Isaac and Jacob and now continuing through Judah and Tamar. It is a very strong pattern that's coming. And again, Bereshit Rabbah tells us, God said to Judah, you said to your father, recognize please, by your life Tamar will say the same to you. That this continuation of this dysfunctional behavior is a very powerful motif throughout this section of the Torah, of people not being clear, not being honest, not being able to see what is before them, drawing the wrong conclusions, and then reaching the wrong decisions about the next course of action. We see that same pattern play out in chapter 39 in the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. When she, meaning Potiphar's wife, saw that he had left it in her hand, meaning Joseph's clothing, his slave garment, and had fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. And when he heard me screaming at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and got away and fled outside. She kept his garment beside her until his master came home, Potiphar. Then she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew slave whom you brought into our house came to me to dally with me. But when I screamed at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and fled outside. So Joseph is again being identified through the garment. And again, the identification is correct, but the conclusion is wrong. Yes, his garment was there, but the reason it was there was, of course, because she was the instigator, not he. That, however, is not going to be recognized by Potiphar or the others, who will instead jump to the conclusion that it was Joseph who must have been the attacker. Questions or comments? Are people able to see that pattern that is stretching throughout this, this section? If so, then we will move on to another broad connection, which is the grief that is felt. We know that Jacob, when he saw his son's bloody cloak, was in great despair. As we see from chapter 37, verse 34, Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, no, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol. Thus his father bewailed him. And of course, just to remind us, the Midianites meanwhile sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward. So the grief of Jacob is incredibly moving in context. And it is something that perhaps the sons did not quite anticipate when they pretended that Joseph was dead. But it is, of course, something that Judah will now experience in his own measure. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, stay a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So we see again that here Judah is now experiencing the same grief that he caused his father. Unfortunately for Judah, the death of his 2 sons are absolutely real and not made up, not a pretend death to cover their crime. But Judah is now feeling what it is like to lose a child, the same way that Jacob feels what it is like to have lost Joseph. So having that experience is going to fundamentally change the way Judah behaves. And we'll see eventually, further on in the story, that it is Judah who stands up to be able to rescue Benjamin, that he is not willing to put his father through the grief of losing a second child, at least one that is as dear to him as Benjamin, even though it may mean that he, Judah, will be under this strange vizier's, Joseph in disguise, again, notice the motif, this strange vizier's punishment. And of course, as a bridge, the issue of desire acts as a transmission between chapter 38 and chapter 39. We know that there is a period after Shua's death where Judah mourns her. But eventually, as he is going up to Timnah for the sheep shearing, when he sees the attractive-looking prostitute, Tamar in disguise, he considers his desire. Judaism is not a fan or even a passive ignoring of prostitution. It is condemned in multiple places, both those who become and those who participate or engage the services of. But here we see that Judah seems to be willing to give in to his desires at that moment. And so it puts him in the predicament where he will then have to admit the error of what he has done in order to be able to exonerate Tamar from the accusation of her adultery, as well as to recognize what will become his grandsons. That desire as an issue is something that also comes up in chapter 39, of course, with Mrs. Potiphar desiring Joseph greatly. And much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her. One such day he came into the house to do his work, none of the household being there inside. She caught hold of him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. As Radak explains for us, the incidents were narrated at this point to demonstrate Joseph's righteousness when on his own without family support, after having in effect been cast out from his family. So by seeing Joseph's behavior in chapter 39, we can see a contrast with Judah's behavior in chapter 38. Joseph, who has nothing to lose and who could perhaps gain much by being more familiar with the lady of the house, chooses to remain righteous, despite there being no one in the community that he is now in who would know or condemn him. It is not as though his family is there to steer his righteousness. Judah, on the other hand, whom we are told also at the beginning of his chapter, went away from his family, when he has the opportunity to visit a prostitute who is not coaxing him daily and who is not holding power over him as the mistress of the house, he gives in to that desire. He gives in. We see that in many ways Joseph is the stronger of the two, who is able to resist that temptation. And by putting these two chapters back to back, the Torah is deliberately asking us to make that comparison and contrast between these two brothers. But it is also telling us that we need to notice that there is a development in Judah, that Judah goes from somebody in chapter 37 who is willing to sell his brother into slavery, well, willing to murder him first, but then choosing to sell as a way of gaining, that he goes from being that man to being one who has suffered the grief similar to what he caused his father, who has suffered humiliation and embarrassment, who has suffered the feelings of desire that led him into a behavior that he knows is wrong and regrets deeply, but is afraid to pursue for fear of becoming a laughingstock. And yet, we know eventually, by the time the families go down into Egypt in the next parasha, that he will have matured from all of these experiences to somebody who is willing to stand up, to do the right thing, to be willing to answer his father's questions and objections when their family is in dire need, that Judah truly becomes a much better person throughout this process. The cycle of chapters that begins with Vayeishev, this parasha, and continues through the end of the Torah, seems to, or end of the book of Genesis, seems to be focused mostly on the life of Joseph. But in fact, Judah is the equal partner in these tales, although it is sprinkled in a way that seems haphazard at first, but with a little bit of digging and poking, a little bit of attention to detail, of noticing the linguistic terminology, flourishes, styles, incidents and events, and how they compare and contrast, we can see that Judah is a co-star of this entire section. And that should not come as a surprise, because this will, in a sense, be the foretaste of what will come during the period of the tribes, and then the period of the dual kingdom. Judah representing the southern kingdom, and Joseph representing the northern kingdoms of Ephraim and Manasseh, which dominated that territory. So seeing this parallel experience with them as young people compared to what their tribes will eventually become is not surprising when you zoom out from the text a little bit. So that's, I want to make sure that point comes across. That as much as it is important to dig down each verse, each word, sometimes a letter in a word during our studies, we can't lose sight of some of the broader messages and the broader trends. The Torah is not written like a modern novel. It is not going to tell us things explicitly that it believes we can figure out simply by paying attention to the text. The Torah does not waste those words that it believes our own intelligence will provide. But that means we have to put our intelligence to work to make sure that we recognize these patterns and trends, these similarities and differences, and all of the other signals the Torah is giving us in order to be able to learn the meta lesson, the over lessons of different sections. Questions and comments on this portion?
Rabbi, I have a question about chapter 38 and Judah. Do we see here the beginning of Tshuva and Judah's moral transformation into a leader because he can lead his brothers in Tshuva, which is a sign of a great leader to lead other people?
Very much. This is indeed one of the clearest examples of Tshuva this early in the Torah, where we have a person say explicitly, I'm wrong, she's right, this is what we need to do to fix things. And for somebody who is clearly the head of the community, the head of his clan, and somebody who is, clearly worried about the embarrassment that might come from different situations, why he refuses to chase down the woman more completely when she disappears, it is more surprising and therefore more brave of him that he is willing to come forward. Remember, she put everything in his hands. She gave him the evidence and basically allowed him to make that decision. If she were purely blackmailing him, then she would have sent him the photos, but not the negatives, so to speak. But instead, she is giving him everything and seeing what he will do, and he is making the right choice. He is doing tshuva, admitting his error, knowing that what he had done was wrong, and that he had forced her into that situation where she had to take those steps. And thus, he is now helping the situation be resolved. And of course, through that, the line of Judah will continue. And of course, it is through these twins that eventually will come the house of David, and thus also the house of the Messiah.
As a person whose name on kibbutz was Tamar, I have a certain affinity because Tamar is a palm tree. So they figured I was from California and I was tall, so they called me Tamar. So I did a lot of reading about Tamar, and she was a very determined woman. I mean, she calculated this whole thing out. I mean, she knew what her rights were, and she knew she had been held up short because she wasn't, and she was on a biological clock. I mean, as a woman, I saw in Tamar a pretty courageous person. And there's only one other Tamar in the Tanakh, which is King David's daughter.
Yes.
Who is a tragic figure.
Very much.
Yeah.
I spoke to her during the sermon last week.
Pardon?
I said I spoke about Tamar, the daughter of David, in my sermon last week.
Yeah. So I would have been in tears. But this Tamar, I think she gets overlooked in many cases in this scenario because it's just like, well, she dressed up like a harlot or what, and it's it seems to me they're drawing the fact, like you said, that he says she's right. Now there has to have been other people around if he says she's right. I think.
Well, it's the term.
I don't think she had.
Right, the term is that he comes out and makes this announcement to the community, and he's using the language of a court decision, which is basically to say,
Yes.
She is in the right, I am wrong. It's almost as though she is exonerated compared to me. I committed an actual sin by withholding. She may look like she committed a sin, but in fact, and this is something that's also often overlooked, she was more worried about my son's lineage than I was.
Right.
Right? Because I'm worried about my son Shella living. She was more worried about the deceased, making sure that his estate would continue, that his line would continue. And it's important to remember, women did not inherit from their husbands or from their children. So she's not in this for the cash, right? She's in this for her husband, who may not have been a saint, as we know, because he died early. But she is still looking out for his interests, even though he is dead.
Thank you.
So throughout this entire section, and really going all the way back to the deception of Isaac and Jacob, what we see is time and time again an almost farcical mistaken identity. From whether it be Esau dressing up and trying to Jacob dressing up as Esau and trying to pretend to be his brother by wrapping his arm in sheepskin, or whether it be Leah being forced into playing the role of Rachel when Jacob is getting married, or whether it be the bloody tunic, the woman who's dressed as the prostitute, or the supposed immoral slave who is actually being more righteous than the aristocratic lady of the house. Time and time again, people are not whom they seem to be. And time again, people keep getting it wrong. They keep judging the book by the cover, if you will. They keep basing their decisions on the flimsiest bits of evidence of what clothes do I see? What's the situation? What would I expect? And jumping to conclusions that leads to near death for numerous people and for a great deal of grief and heartache for everyone else. And if we only took the time to slow down, examine people more carefully, see what is truly in their heart, see what the circumstances of their life truly is, know who they are under the veil that they wear, we would be able to do much better in all of our relationships and life situations. And of course, this isn't done yet, because we're going to have the next big deception, beginning with Joseph in Egypt. After he interprets the dreams and becomes number 2 in the land, he will go on to perpetrate the reverse deception on his brothers while pretending to be someone he's not. And that revelation at the end is going to be the final end to this style of story, where we finally see somebody being fully honest with who they are and accepting his brothers for who they are, because he has now seen them clearly since they revealed themselves to him in the way they defended one another. And that ultimately is what's going to let our nation become unified for that point in our history. So stop pretending to be someone you're not, and stop letting others pretend to be someone they aren't as well. Try and be and try and see a true person. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful Hanukkah as it is set to begin. And hopefully we all light additional candles and add a little more light into the world.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Hag Sameach.